I feel certainly a lot better for going into the Army, because I don't think anybody can tell me that I'm not a Canadian. I think that's a big thing for me, that I know where I belong, and nobody can make any remarks about that.
Susan and I feel so honored to be here in beautiful Halliburton at your renowned speaker series. And although my father, Susan's father and mother are no longer here, we know they would be incredibly proud. We'd also just like to acknowledge that both of our projects did receive support from the Japanese Canadian Legacy Society. So I'm just going to start with why I created the Samurai in Our Closet podcast. And this is my honorable father, George Shintani, and myself at the back of our house in small town, Ontario. And really, thanks to our parents, we lived the Canadian middle-class dream. You can see even the photo here that we lived in a white bungalow with blue trim in a lovely neighborhood. You gotta love the brown knee socks with shorts. But inside our home, we had a secret that my parents told us never to disclose. And here's an audio clip from the beginning of the podcast.
Shh! Don't tell anyone, but we have a secret in our family. We have a real samurai sword. My dad says it's hundreds of years old, but I don't know how we got it. And now it lives in our closet.
We only saw that samurai sword a few times when my father would take it out of its sheath very quietly, as if it was a ceremony, and we thought it was both beautiful but dangerous. Looking back, though, I realized that 450-year-old samurai sword represented the silence not only around our family, but the history of the Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. And I think because we didn't grow up with the stories, we weren't even told that our parents, all of our aunts and uncles were interned. We weren't taught the language or the culture. And there were very few other Japanese Canadians in our community. And I think that really left us with a sense of disconnection, a loneliness, and we didn't have a clear sense of who we were or our parents. And I find this hard to say, but there was also a quiet feeling of shame about being a Canadian of Japanese heritage. From our parents, we also inherited a subconscious drive for complete integration, and I believe contributed to my generation having a 95% rate of interracial marriage. This is one of the highest in Canada, and I believe this really represents a unique aspect of the Japanese-Canadian experience. But when my father passed away when he was 97, I knew it was time to unlock the mystery of our sword. But I feared the stories would be too sad. And Japanese Canadians excel at many things, but we don't do sad well. And yes, in this journey, there were many heartbreaking, shocking, and surprising stories. But ultimately, I learned about some of the most powerful and inspiring stories of the collective sacrifice of my grandparents and parents' generation, all for the sake of providing us with a better future. So thank you so much for joining me in this deeply personal journey. In my search for our stories, I spoke with over 70 playwrights, authors, historians, and even my own relatives, family, and children for the first time. And here's some highlights of what I learned along the way. So we're going to start with the Issei, or first generation, who came to BC in the late 1800s. And I had always believed the narrative that the internment had to happen because of Pearl Harbor. But what I learned from author Tosh Kitagawa is that to find out about the roots of the internment, we'd have to go all the way back to when BC joined Confederation. One of the first acts of legislation that the governments enforced stated that no Chinaman or Indian would have the right to vote, and soon after, Japanese Canadians were added. But these groups were also severely restricted to work in 4 industries. However, through perseverance, hard work, and innovation, Japanese Canadians were instrumental in building up BC after Confederation. As they could only afford the poorest land, they actually revolutionized farming through the use of heated greenhouses, which really allowed for year-round crop production. And they helped build the fishing industry as highly skilled fishermen and renowned boat builders. And despite being banned in BC from serving in World War I, to prove their loyalty to Canada, 222 volunteers went to Alberta to enlist, and they served with valor in Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and the Somme. 92 were decorated for bravery, and sadly, 54 were killed. My father was Nisei, meaning second generation, and he grew up in an area called Japantown, which we now refer to as the downtown east side in Vancouver. And I'm not sure if you've seen this area, but it is now filled with, derelict warehouses. It's an area where many people are unhoused. But in my father's childhood, this was really a vibrant center of the community. And it was bustling. There was over 400 thriving Japanese Canadian-owned businesses, as you can see in the top photo there. And my father, like many young boys, dreamed of playing for the Asahi baseball team. To me, the Asahis represented gaman, or resilience. They were very small in stature, but they used a strategic style of play known as brain ball, which we now call money ball. And they became Vancouver's favorite team. So here is Kei Kamanishi. He's the last surviving Asahi player speaking in the Heritage Minute video.
We were born in Canada. We spoke English. On the streets, we weren't welcome. But on the field, we were the Asahi, Vancouver's champions. Everyone cheered for us. Our people had a voice.
Despite segregation, the Asahis were always trying to break down the racial divide. However, at the same time, anger and resentment of the prosperity of Japanese Canadians continued to grow. And I think it's best captured in this next clip from the Native Sons of BC.
The Native Sons of British Columbia are unequivocally opposed to extending the franchise to the Asiatic races. Many of us can remember the days when the Orientals, then comparatively few in number, were our servants. We saw them leave those humble domestic and manual pursuits in which they were engaged and become the competitors to our farmers. Then they gradually entered into trade and the business occupations of our urban life and invaded the professions. Once our servants, now our competitors in industrial occupations and commercial and economic spheres. Today they are demanding full citizenship. Give it to them, and tomorrow they will be our masters.
Then came the event that changed everything. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The BC government is well aware that the RCMP and the Canadian military have found no evidence of a credible threat from the Japanese-Canadian community. And initially, there was resistance from the federal government as well as opposition from the CCF, now called the NDP. However, regardless of those facts, the BC government enforces the War Measures Act to intern 22 out of 24,000 Japanese Canadians who live within 100 miles of the coast. The speed in which 1,200 boats, as you can see in this picture, were confiscated was no accident. Japanese Canadians had been under years of surveillance, and their homes and assets were well known to the authorities. These assets were taken under the complete reassurance that they would all be returned when the war was over. I thought my father was interned with his family. However, what I learned was, first, the RCMP took the fathers and the older sons from their homes, and they forced them to work in remote road camps, as you can see in this top picture, to build highways using only picks and shovels. Here is activist Mary Kitagawa remembering the day when the RCMP roared into their beautiful farm on Salt Spring Island to take away their father.
Father lined us all up, said, "Be strong, I'll be back soon." And then as my father was getting into the truck, the RCMP officer shoved him on, and my father fell on his stomach and also hit his face. My father jumped right up to reassure us that he was fine. And he kept smiling and saying, "I'm okay, I'm okay." As my father was being driven out of our property, the RCMP officer jerked the gears in the truck, and my father almost fell again. And as he was driving away, the girls, the four of us, ran after the truck, crying and waving and saying, "Daddy, Daddy, come back." But in my 7-year-old mind, I thought, because of the way he was being manhandled, I thought for sure that my father was being taken away to be shot. I feel that at that time, every cell in my mother's body must have been exploding with pain. But she did not cry or anything. She just stayed very strong for us. And she tried to make each day as normal as possible.
Men that opposed leaving behind their elderly parents, wives, or children, or who were simply viewed as leaders in the community, were taken from their homes without warning or trial, all the way to remote prisoner of war camps in northern Ontario, some of them for many years. And in the photo on the bottom, you can see that they had red circles on the back of their shirts so that they were an easier target to shoot in the event they tried to escape. Women and children, as you can see in the photo here, were actually held in a livestock barn. This was a temporary holding site at Hastings Park in Vancouver. And I didn't know about the barn, so in my mid-40s, I was telling my mother about a great night that we had on betting on the horses at the Hastings racetrack when my mother blurted out, "Well, that's where they kept us." And I said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" And she said, "They imprisoned us in that barn," and I was speechless. My father wrote in his journal that this was one of the cruelest aspects of the internment, that women and children, or mothers and children, were left alone to face leaving their beloved homes, and they were given only 24 to 48 hours to pack 2 suitcases per adult. Here is Mary Kitagawa again, talking about the day she arrived at the barn.
Shocked because I was an asthmatic child. Our house was always spotless. And then to be asked to live in a barn was unacceptable to her, because she was thinking that if there was enough dust there that I would get my asthma and I would die. We were all dressed up. We shined our shoes before we left, and as we walked in we could smell the urine and feces of the barn. We could hear some of the elderly women crying and sobbing. This was the area that just women and children were allowed, and the children had to be under the age of 12.
According to author Dan Takawa, with crowded conditions, as you can see in this photo, and virtually no medical care, 13 Japanese Canadians died at Hastings Park. As part of creating the podcast, I went on a bus tour of all the different internment sites, where I visited the remote ghost mining town of Sandon. And you can see in the photo here, it's a valley that's stuck between 2 mountains, and it was one of 10 main internment sites. In the photo, you can see my father with his mother and 2 of his sisters in the wintertime. And what I realized is that his family was really one of the lucky ones, as they were housed in abandoned old buildings, whereas my mother's family was at another internment site called Lemon Creek. And they went from living in a 10-bedroom house with greenhouses, at the time they were building a tennis court, to living in a tent in one of the coldest winters on record, 40 below. Later, families were moved into tar-papered shacks with no insulation. On the rare times that I would ask my father, what was it like living in the internment camp as a teenager, he said something to me that I thought was unbelievable. He said, "Actually, it was fun." And it felt like another story he was afraid to tell us. But then I saw these photos, and the kids are performing in acrobatic shows. The girls are smiling. You can see roaming in the mountains. And this is when Mary Kitagawa explained to me it was fun for the children because of the incredible sacrifice of the mothers, older sisters, who put aside their feelings of bitterness, despair, fear, and anger to work collectively to create a close community for the sake of the children. They created schools, clubs, games, parades, and sports teams. Susan's going to talk more about what it was like for the teachers and the students. Chuck Tasaka, who was born in Greenwood, another internment site, said that he didn't even know it was an internment camp until he was older. Where they were housed was also only other Japanese Canadians, so they also were free from discrimination. And there were acts of kindness and allies, such as the indigenous and Doukhobors who brought vegetables and fish. They knew that there were neighbors and friends back in their hometown that were heartbroken and were storing some of their family treasures in the hopes of returning them after the war was over. As part of the War Measures Act, Japanese Canadian men were again banned from enlisting in the Second World War. Canada only relented after immense pressure from the Allies, including direct communication from Winston Churchill. I really found it hard to understand. Why would my father, along with 148 young men, volunteer to serve despite being labeled as an enemy alien until I heard this recording?
The reason is to stand up for our right, have that right as a citizen in the country. Manager of the Canadian Tire plant, I was working there with Patterson. And he said, George, he said, I wouldn't enlist in the Army. He said, in 10 years' time, nobody will remember what happened to you people. And I said, well, that's probably true, but I'll never be able to forget it.
Many of these young men enlisted and had to face opposition not only from some people within their own community, but within their own families. My cousin Glenn shared that when his father, Ray Takeuchi, was dying, he told him that his own father never spoke to him again after he enlisted. Here's the last surviving veteran, Frank Morisugu, telling the story of his mother warning him of the incredible risk he was taking by enlisting.
Drinking tea into the night, and finally my mother says, in Japanese, she says, if you get captured by the Japanese, jisatsu shinasai, kill yourself. This is the Japanese way, you say, right? But anyway, she said, the Japanese will be just like the people in BC. They will not understand that you are a Canadian. They will look at you, and they will treat you much worse than anybody else that they capture at the same time. So, kill yourself. I said, okay, Mom. But it brought home something that, of course, all of us are aware of. That, hell, you know, it's one thing to show that we're Canadians, another thing is to go to war.
But what I learned is that these young men, my father was really just a teenager, whose first language was English, underwent rigorous military and Japanese language training. My father used to just say, he was very humble, like many of the Nisei soldiers. He used to say, I was just a translator in the army. And so we used to picture him quietly sitting in a corner, changing Japanese documents into English. But what we found out was that the original intention of the Canadian Army, Canadian government, was to train them to become spies. However, when the war ended, my father was still in training, so his role became investigating war crimes for the Canadian Intelligence Corps. So the irony of being interned as a threat to national security to working on the top secret files. He was investigating one of the most notorious war crimes committed by the Japanese Army, the construction of the bridge over the River Kwai in Southeast Asia. It was also called the Death Railway, in which 160,000 citizens and prisoner of war soldiers died in its construction. And here's where I learned where our samurai sword came from. It was during this time that my father, along with other men in his unit, received samurai swords that had belonged to Japanese doctors. They had hid them in their medical supplies. But as Japan had surrendered, the doctors were going to be shipped back to Japan, and their swords were surrendered. They were relieved that the swords were going to be handed over to Canadians rather than the American forces. Back in BC, the war is over. The War Measures Act was no longer enforceable. Japanese Canadians were no longer a threat to national security. So the government decides to enact another legislation and enforce a cruel ultimatum. Get out of BC. Go to Japan or go east of the Rockies. And many Nisei told me, looking back, this was the most difficult time of the internment. They were being forcibly uprooted for a second time after they had rebuilt these close communities, and they actually helped to revitalize these ghost towns that they had been moved to. They were now going to be sent out into the unknown to Japan, which had been devastated by the war, and many of these Japanese Canadians had never been to Japan, or dispersed across Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec, but this time without other Japanese Canadians. Their homes and belongings had been sold, used, in fact, to finance their own interment. They had lost the right to return home, and they were forced to start again with virtually nothing. Japanese Canadians were not allowed to return back to BC until 1949. Here's a photo of my father and his unit upon their return to Canada from Southeast Asia. My father experienced injustices back home and then went on to investigate some of the worst atrocities and war crimes. And yet he and the other Nisei soldiers maintained a sense of optimism and a belief in what they did. Still, I wondered, did my father think all his sacrifice was worth it? Until I heard interviewer Linda Kawamoto-Reed ask him this question.
Nightmares? She had trouble sleeping when you got there?
No, I don't have any problem. I feel certainly a lot better for going into the Army. Because I don't think anybody can tell me that I'm not a Canadian. I think that's a big thing for me. That I know where I belong. And that nobody can make any remarks about that.
I like when my father said, I know where I belong. And my father remained his life one of the most loyal Canadians I've ever met. As I was creating the podcast, it began to feel like the most important journey that I would ever experience. I interviewed Wayne Takeuchi, a Sansei, or third generation Japanese Canadian like myself, and he really helped me to understand that the Issei and Nisei, or first and second generation, were under the belief that as long as we did not know the stories, we would never be harmed, thus enabling us to enjoy living the Canadian dream. Here's a clip from my sister Claire explaining what I hoped would be the result of finally learning our stories.
Feel about hearing all the stories in the podcast?
I feel lighter. Okay, I'm going to cry. Did you cry a lot? I cried after hearing every episode.
I cried every day listening to all the stories.
I just cried because of what happened to them, but also the way they conducted themselves. I cried because the kindness of friends and strangers. I feel lighter. I feel like I finally get it. I understand. And Dad used to say this thing, tell them you're Japanese Canadian, right? Over and over. And I finally get it. I really belong here. And it's because of those guys. And they did it the hard way. And they never even mentioned it.
They were so humble about the whole thing.
I get it. I understand. I understand my parents a lot more.
Do you understand yourself more?
definitely. Definitely. I just feel more grounded, right? But at the same time, lighter. I'm not carrying around this, whatever it was, just knowing. I just feel better.
I know the story now, and I agree with you. I feel so proud to be Canadian of Japanese heritage.
I spoke with artist Lillian Yano Blakey, who sadly just recently passed away. And she said the storytelling must continue, especially with the younger generation. And it's been incredibly inspiring to see the Yonsei and Gosei, meaning fourth and fifth generations, creating books and poetry, as you can see here on the slide, films and plays. And many now are being used in schools, as Japanese Canadian history is now mandatory in BC high schools. And for me, the arts matter deeply. I didn't learn our history at home. It was through books and plays that gave me permission to learn more. Finally, we wanted to learn or to figure out what to do with my father's samurai sword. My father never believed that the sword belonged to him. Rather, he was the custodian of the sword. Here's my father discussing his sword.
It's a real treasure as far as I'm concerned, if I find a right home for it, I will give it up.
And I'm happy to say that the sword's new home is at the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, BC. And I hope that my father's sword inspires people of all backgrounds to learn their family histories and stories. And finally, I believe in my heart that my father would be happy that the story is out of the closet, especially in today's political climate around the world, as a cautionary tale of the age-old universal story of what happens to ordinary people, including women and children, such as the Japanese Canadians who really were model citizens, when anger and fear are used to permit terrible injustices. But I also hope that the sword symbolizes the best of humankind, the people who chose to speak out or do what is right in difficult times. And of course, a tribute to the incredible sacrifice of the Issei and Nisei, who dedicated their lives for a better future, not only for the next generation of Japanese Canadians, but for all Canadians. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our talks. It's wonderful to see such an enthusiastic and supportive audience. And I want to thank the Legion, too, for hosting us. It's such an appropriate venue for this talk, as you will find out. Before we start, could you please raise your hand if you are related to Japanese Canadians who were interned? Oh, there's a big concentration in the front row. And of those people that were, how many of you had relatives who were interned in Kaslo? Oh, much smaller number, but there are some people here. My mother, Kazuko Shinobu, was born in Vancouver, but she was forced to move to Kaslo, BC, with her family in 1942 because she was Japanese. She taught grade 3 there. There's my mother's ID card. Mandy mentioned that before Pearl Harbor, the government had collected lots of information on Japanese Canadians. This is one example. This ID card was collected before everyone had to carry around ID cards, and this was before Pearl Harbor. In my mother's basement, I found children's drawings, photos of teachers and students, valentines, and censored wartime correspondence. These all dated from my mother's time in Kaslo. The Langham Museum in Kaslo hosted a display based on Mom's collection in 2025. These wonderful historic pictures drawn by Mom's students deserved an audience. On finding them, I knew they had to be displayed at the Langham Museum with the stories of the students. Fortunately, the Langham staff agreed. So on the table in this room at the back, as Mandy mentioned, are booklets with many pictures and photos from this slideshow. Please look at them if you have time after the talk. This is my grandmother, Sada Shinobu. She was a fine arts teacher. She was highly educated. She taught in a girls' art school in Japan, and later she taught in the Imperial Palace. She taught needlework during the Meiji era to the relatives of Emperor Meiji and Emperor Hirohito. In Vancouver, she established a school called the Girls' College of Practical Arts. And I think one of Mandy's aunts actually attended the school. She taught sewing, she taught cooking, deportment. It was for young Japanese women. And these pieces of art that you see, the kimono and the pictures, they were all done by my grandmother. They're all made out of silk. The cat and the tiger were embroidered. And I just really hate to think about how much my grandmother created and had to leave behind when she was interned. This is my grandfather, Saburo Shinobu. When he married my grandmother, his name was originally Takahashi, but he took her name, so his name became Shinobu. He was an insurance agent and a certified life underwriter, and he was also a community leader and activist among the Japanese Canadians. He raised money for the Japanese Canadian War Memorial, which is shown here. That's a picture of him with his veteran friends. He was instrumental in obtaining the vote for Japanese Great War veterans in 1931. And as a result, he was given a space in the 1936 Vimy pilgrimage. So there's a picture of my grandfather at Vimy Ridge. He attended the opening of the Vimy Memorial. He saw King Edward VIII unveil the memorial, and this was the same king that abdicated a few months later. My grandfather and his veteran friends lobbied successfully for the vote at the BC legislature in 1931. Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Spencer, the MLA for Vancouver, also supported Japanese Canadian veterans getting the vote because he had commanded many in a First World War battalion. Nelson Spencer helped my father's family escape to Ontario before they could be interned. And when I was at the War Museum last week, I felt like I was name dropping because Nelson Spencer's name is very well known to people that know about World War I. My mother's family did not live in Japantown in the downtown east side like Mandy's father. My mother was one of the few Japanese Canadian students at her schools. On the left, you see the Shinobu family sitting beside their Heinzmann piano, which now resides in the War Museum. Why is that? It's because they loved their piano so much that they had it when they were interned in Kaslo. On the right, this is a picture taken in 1935 at the Vancouver Japanese United Church. My mother is number 1 in this photo, and Reverend Kosaburo Shimizu, the minister at the Vancouver Japanese United Church, he's number 2. And Su Matsugu, who would later become a teacher at Kaslo, is number 3. My uncle Min is number 4. He served with Mandy's father and my father in the Second World War. Number 5 are my grandmothers. My grandmother's school and my grandfather's insurance office were located in this building at 302 Alexander Street in Vancouver. The building's still there. It's pretty run down. This is a map showing the internment sites in BC, including self-supporting camps where people had the privilege of paying for their own internment, road construction camps where the men were sent, marked in magenta, and prison camps marked in black circles, including Caslow. Not shown are the prairie sugar beet farms where internees lived and worked in very harsh conditions, and the POW camps in Ontario where some were incarcerated. There were 2 POW camps for Japanese Canadians. One is at Petawawa, Ontario, very close actually to where I live. And the other one was called Angler, and it was located at Marathon on Lake Superior. People that lived in the light gray areas, you don't see it very well, but see this area west of this dotted line. That's called the protected area. People that were living in the protected area were evacuated to different camps, and that was 90% of the Japanese Canadian population. Here are some facts that many Canadians, even Japanese Canadians, don't know about the internment. Some of them are things that Mandy said before, but I don't think it's a bad thing to reiterate them. Having the vote gave Japanese Great War veterans no special privileges. They were interned just like everybody else after having served in the First World War and, having won medals. After the camps were closed in 1945, Japanese Canadians were forbidden from returning to BC. Mandy mentioned the order, go east of the Rockies or go back to Japan. Well, really, there was nothing to return to in BC. Everything was gone, right? The government had sold everything without the internees' permission. 4,000 former internees were deported from the prison camps to Japan in 1946. 66% were Commonwealth citizens by birth or naturalization, and 1/3 were under 16. They were just kids. So I learned that most Japanese Canadians have no family photos from before the internment. Family albums were of lower priority than other essentials during evacuation. Plus, many people thought, we'll get everything back later when the war is over. Some of them said, oh, it's a good thing that the government is taking care of our stuff. During wartime, my mother's family wisely stored their photos with friends who were not being interned. These albums have photographs dating back to the Meiji era in Japan, when my mother started to lose her short-term memory but still retained her long-term memory. We looked over hundreds of photos from Japan, Vancouver, and Caslow, and we tried to identify the people in them. We went through all the Japanese Canadian books in Mom's house and recorded my mother's memories of all these people. We also read the letters sent to my mother from the 1930s onward. This kept my mother very busy and it distracted her from the fact that her memory was disappearing. I felt like it was a race against time. My mother's family was evacuated to Caslow, which was a derelict ghost town, in September 1942. The internees were shipped from Nelson to Caslow on boats. The population of Caslow was not happy about these Japanese Canadians arriving, and it actually, I think there were 500 people living in Caslow, and by the time the Japanese Canadians arrived, there were 1,500. The colorized photo on the left shows the 2 places where the Shinobu family lived, the Caslow Hotel and a rented house on Center Street. The picture on the right shows the rented house, and Shirley Shikaze just showed me a picture that she had showing my mother and her members of her family standing in front of the same house. She showed this picture to me just a few minutes ago. But This is the top left photo shows the main street in Kaslo called Front Street. In the foreground is the Kaslo Opera House, where my grandfather managed internees' luggage. Internees' rooms were so small and cramped that they had to store their luggage elsewhere. The years that my mother spent as an internee were when she should have been in university. Her family's finances were devastated by internment, so she never attended. Her high school graduation photo, right here, indicates that there were just 3 local graduates and 8 internee graduates at the Kaslo High School. The intern Japanese Canadians quickly organized activities in Kaslo to support each other and to make their own life more pleasant despite the circumstances. On the left is the Kaslo Haiku Club. Whoops, I knew that would happen. And you can see that the members of the club wore their best clothes for this picture. And on the right is the sewing school that my grandmother organized in the Kaslo Hotel. This included several of the internee teachers that worked with my mother, plus the mothers of some of my mother's students. My grandmother is standing in the front row and in the center. The United Church in Kaslo was a very strong and positive influence on internee life. The minister, Reverend Shimizu, shown here, he had been the minister at the very large Japanese United Church in Vancouver, and he brought his congregation with him to Kaslo, many members of his congregation, including my mother's family. Mandy mentioned that 148 Japanese Canadians enlisted in the military during the Second World War. These men served in the European and Pacific theaters while their families were interned in camps or on sugar beet farms. These 11 men served while their families were interned in Kaslo. The third man that's listed, Gregory Ohashi, he was actually interned in a prisoner of war camp at, both Petawawa and Angler before he volunteered for the Army. I don't know how anyone could do that. And when Mandy and I were at the War Museum last week, a woman came up to me after the talk and she said, "You know, the guy that's right at the bottom of that list, that was my uncle." So a month-long summer school was held at New Denver in 1943 to train 125 Nisei to teach in the 10 prison camps. Soon after that, my mother found herself in front of a class of 30 grade 3 students. She was 18 years old and she had just graduated from grade 12. There were 9 teachers at the Kootenay Lake School. They were high school or university graduates. Few Japanese Canadian women finished high school. Most dropped out to support their families. This is what the school looked like in 1942. Oops. It's an old hardware store. This is what it looked like in 2018. That building is still there. It's gone through many, many incarnations. Last year it housed a sporting goods store. This is my mother and some of the other teachers pretending to be students. And this is Molly Fujita and Martha Yamazaki. And I know Martha's niece, Lynn, is here in the audience. At the top, this picture was drawn by Jim Miyazaki, one of my mother's students. You can see that the school was next door to a bakery. Oops. Years later, my mother could only remember the name of 3 students: the top student, the student that caused the most trouble, and a student whose family was deported to Japan. 27 Kaslo families were deported, and these included 5 of Mom's students. This was my mother's first paid job. She had had very little experience before with young children, and she was a very shy person. As far as I know, she never expressed any further interest in teaching school after her year in Kaslo. Now, 2 of Mom's students are in this group of children. Their names are marked in blue, Yuko and Ruth. But the little girl with her eyes closed in the middle, right here, with the thing in her hair, the decoration, is Shirley Shikaze. At that time, her name was Miwako Arai. This is another aerial view of some of the buildings in Kaslo. This included the Archer House, which it housed 21 people from 5 different families. It was close to my mother's house. This is the BC Security Commission building. The BC Security Commission was tasked with managing the internment of the Japanese Canadians. The Kaslo Hotel and Langham Hotel, which is now a museum, these held about half of the internees that lived in Kaslo. So my mother asked her students to draw various buildings in Kaslo. Most of the kids drew the houses or buildings that they were living in. So Jim and Isami drew the west side of the Langham Hotel, which is now the Langham Museum, where their drawings were displayed 80 years later. The Langham Hotel was very run down. Most of the buildings in Kaslo were quite run down when the Japanese arrived. As you can see, the Langham Hotel got very dilapidated by the 1960s, but luckily in the 1970s, a group of hippies moved in from the United States and renovated it. So it's now a beautiful, beautiful museum building. This building is called the Kaslo Hotel. This building no longer exists in this configuration. 4 of my mother's students drew this building. Several hundred people lived here, packed in like sardines. The Shinobu family spent several weeks there, were horrified by the living conditions, and they moved quickly to the Center Street house, paying rent out of their savings. Some of the former students told me that the rooms had cockroaches in the kitchens, and they really they were not comfortable there. This is the Kaslo drugstore. 3 of my mother's students, Makoto, Takashi, and Sachiko, lived there, and they lived in the area above the drugstore with their families. This drugstore building it's gone. It does not exist anymore. Naomi Teranishi, she drew the Burns building. It was a meat market, and Naomi, who now lives in Winnipeg, said that she and her family lived in the ice house behind the meat market. Some of the kids drew houses that they lived in. A lot of the houses were, well, like most of the buildings in Kaslo, they were dilapidated. Kaslo was basically a ghost town. But some of the kids lived in individual homes, although there were several families living in each home. So this is the John Keane house on the left, drawn by Reiko. I checked last year, this house is no longer there. The Archer house, which I showed you before, it had 21 people living in it. The Archer house actually still exists. This house was drawn by Raymond Tunney, and I checked, it no longer exists. It was near the hospital, and it was kind of up on a hill, and it was just actually beside the house that the Yamazaki family lived in. So Lynn, I know you're in the audience. This is the house next door to where your family's house lived in. The house on the right belonged to Susumu Shimizu. He was a nice little boy that my mother really liked, but he was deported to Japan with his family. And this is my favorite picture, the house that Susumu drew. It exists still, and it hasn't changed very much. It's right across the street from the Langham Museum, and it's now an Airbnb. These are valentines that were sent to my mother by her students. They're old-fashioned looking valentines. There was no class list that my mother compiled, nothing that I could find anyway. The students' names were obtained from the drawings and valentines, and as you can see, many of the kids signed their work, their their pictures or the Valentines by their first names only. So determining the full names of the students took me months of detective work. I was able to locate 15 students, former students or their families, and I interviewed 13. 8 former students are still alive of the original 30. The memories shared by my mother's students when I interviewed them, similar to what Mandy said, I was surprised to find out that they said they had fun. They actually enjoyed their internment. They had mostly positive memories. They remembered skating. They remember swimming in the Kootenay Lake. They remember tobogganing from the big hill near the hospital. And they had good memories. They were with lots of kids their age, Japanese kids. The schools were segregated, so the Japanese school had no local kids, and the local school had no Japanese kids. There was no racism because the schools were separated. It was really they had fun because their mothers and grandparents shielded the children from the reality, and the reality was that they were basically prisoners in jail. Some of the kids struggled in school because they'd never spoken English before. Some of them came from places like Steveston, which were Japanese communities. The first of my mother's students that I was able to meet was Marina Yoshida. Her father was sent to a road camp in Alberta from Vancouver very early. And so her mother had to prepare for internment in Kaslo by herself. And she was struggling alone to manage 3 young kids at the same time and wondering if she'd ever see her husband again. So this postcard, written by my mother in 1944, tells about how my mother and her friend Martha left Kaslo for good, heading to Toronto in 1944 by bus and train. Marina and her family were also traveling east to Ontario, which was an unknown place for everyone. Her father, Marina's father, was still in Alberta. Mrs. Yoshida had morning sickness, so my mother and Martha took care of the children on the trip. In 2018, Marina told me, "I will never forget your mother's kindness to my mother, who was coping with 4 young children as we set out to come east in 1944. Marina became my good friend, but she died in 2023. Her brother Robert, the baby that Mom mentioned in the postcard, helped me write Marina's biography. So in 2028, Martha, Marina, myself, and our friend Kazue from Japan, we had a little reunion. Unfortunately, my mother was not well enough to attend this reunion. This is Samira Tanaka. Her married name is Shintani. Samira Shintani is a well-known Japanese-Canadian fabric artist, and she lives in Toronto. Her parents were very highly educated, and they owned a Japanese language school in New Westminster. After Pearl Harbor, Samira's father was abruptly dragged out of their home, by the RCMP, and Samira was there when this happened. And his crime was that he was a community leader. He was one of 40 Japanese community leaders that were interned in POW camps, both at Petawawa and then later at Angler. So Samira's mother and siblings were moved to the Tashmi camp after they had been in Kaslo. The 3 pictures shown below, the black and white pictures, show what Tashmi looked like. Generally, I think Japanese Canadian internees considered Kaslo to be kind of the crown jewel, if you can call it, of internment camps, and Tashmi was right down near the bottom. These photos were sent from Tashmi to my mother from Samira's older sister, Naomi. The Tanaka family did not see their dad again for 5 years because of all the time he spent in the POW camp. The family was reunited in Chatham in Ontario. This fellow is Paul Yamaguchi. He became a high school principal. He's now retired, of course. He lives in Toronto. Tenants that were living in his family's house, a rooming house, stole all the furniture when the family was interned in Kaslo. And there were, I think, 11 rooms in the rooming house, 11 or 12, and they were never compensated for that theft. Paul's family lived in the Langham Hotel in Kaslo. In Kaslo, only 2 internees were allowed to have vehicles. That was the minister of the United Church and the doctor, the Japanese doctor. So Paul recalls that the doctor would give Paul and his friend Shin drives around Kaslo between house calls. Paul's mother learned sewing in Kaslo, possibly from my grandmother, and she worked as a dressmaker professionally when the family moved to Hamilton, Ontario. This letter was written by my mother in 1945 from Toronto. Her parents were still in Kaslo, so my mother was asking her parents to thank Mrs. Yamaguchi for baking cookies and sending them to her in Toronto. I showed this letter to Paul just a few months ago, and he said, yep, that was definitely my mother. She was always baking cookies. And this is Jim Miyazaki. Jim's family lived in the Langham Hotel, which is, of course, the museum. He said that the BC government bragged that they stocked the lakes with fish, but in reality, the Japanese Canadians were not allowed to fish. They would get in trouble with the Mounties if they were caught fishing. This is very cruel because a third of the people the internees living in Kaslo were from fishing towns like Steveston. Jim said, I don't remember any of my teachers from grade 1 to grade 5, but I remember Miss Shinobu. She was the only teacher who tried to help me read and spell. She kept me after school to teach me, but I was real bad in those days, and I skipped many times. He suffered from undiagnosed dyslexia. So my mother died in 2019, and Jim was I started talking to Jim about 2 years ago, and he was so disappointed to hear that he didn't get to speak to my mother. So when Mandy and I gave a talk last November, Jim came with his wife, and he got up and he thanked my mother for all the extra help that she had given him. It was very moving. And Jim said, I was so sorry that my parents did not live long enough to hear the Canadian government apologize, and they didn't get to spend the redress money. So in 1988, the government of Brian Mulroney officially apologized to Japanese Canadians for everything that happened during the internment. And they gave each survivor of the internment $20,000. And so, unfortunately, by that time, the people that suffered the most, that's the first generation, they were all gone. They were mostly gone. So my grandparents had died. My father had died. My mother got the $20,000 and immediately bought a Toyota. So Jim is one of the biggest supporters of this internment camp project. So Jim and 3 generations of his family visited the Langham Museum during the exhibit last year. Jim lives in Toronto as part of the internment camp bus tour. So he came with 6 members of the Miyazaki family visited the Langham Museum. The museum staff were crying as they watched the family standing in front of Jim's drawings. These are Jim's drawings, and visiting the tiny room that the Miyazakis once lived in. Jim's father had been the janitor at the Langham Hotel. This is the interior of the very beautiful Langham Museum with the students' drawings on one wall. These are the drawings, and on the other wall, photographs of the students. Below the student drawings are QR codes that link to the student biographies. On the plinth by the far door are the booklets that I brought today, and I encourage you to take a look at them if you have time. I was only able to contact 2 of the teachers' families. All of the teachers now are unfortunately deceased. as mentioned before, I contacted about half of Mom's students. Some of the kids had died immediately after internment. Some of the kids were deported and couldn't be traced. Some of the kids had died over the years but had no descendants. These are the students. The students in this picture are the students whose stories I was able to collect. In some cases, I spoke to their siblings, children, nieces, and nephews. Many of the students and their family members have become my close friends. They phone me, they send me gifts. They occasionally send me letters saying, oh, you know, the person in the lower right, the lower right of that photograph, that's so-and-so. So they've been very, very helpful. These friendships have been an unexpected gift to me from my mother. So, yeah, I think it's so appropriate that we are being hosted at the Legion, and I want to make a late-breaking news announcement. Coincidentally, this happened on my birthday. On May the 6th, 2025, the Japanese-Canadian Legion Branch No. 9, which had been established in 1926 in Vancouver and forced during the war to disband, had its charter reinstated. My grandfather, Mr. Shinobu, had been the branch secretary. So on May 7th, Mandy and I were speaking at the Canadian War Museum. We relayed the good news to the audience, which included many Japanese Canadians. So I'm very happy to end a talk on a positive note. So I'd like to acknowledge Barry, Sean, Jack, Tammy, Eric, Pat, another Pat, and Gwen, and our very kind hosts, Barbara and Reiner, the Samurai in Our Closet podcast committee. Two of the members are here. These are Jay and Claire. These are Mandy's sisters. The Langham staff and Kootenay Lakes archive staff in Caslow, and the families of the Caslow students and teachers, and also our husbands, Garth and Stuart. So, thank you for your interest in our stories, and don't try not to notice that we never change our haircuts.
So we're going to take some questions now.
Oh, I just want to mention one more thing. On the left side of this picture, the left picture is the Legion banner showing Mandy's father, George Shintani. It was displayed on Georgia Street in Vancouver in November 2025. George's banner is on the left side of the pole. This presentation is in honor of George Shintani and my parents, Kazuko and Eiji Yatabe. Thank you. I guess we can do this.
Questions?
Take it off. Oh, take it off there. Like that? Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah, you talked about redress. Was there ever any other action taken, legal or suits or anything, to return property or
Yeah. Well, what year was that? Oh, there was a redress for and a public apology also from the BC government, and that redress is happened a couple years ago, and that actually enabled us both to have funding to do these projects. So, yeah. I think there was also one, I mean, some Japanese Canadians did try to go to court to obtain back the true value of their property. There was one case of a farmer in Salt Spring Island, one of the Gulf Islands, and he had 600 acres. So the market value today would be $100 million. And he took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and he lost. And unfortunately, they said he passed away quite bitter about that battle. But I don't think anyone has been successful in terms of getting their land back. So you can see, some of the Nisei got back $20,000, but the true value of what they lost is there's not really much of a comparison, but thank you for asking.
There was one man in Kaslo. His name was Zenosuke Tanaka, I think. He was a World War I vet. He was the only World War I vet that got his property back. In fact, he was the only Japanese Canadian, I think, that was able to get his property back after the Second World War internment.
Could you just repeat the question?
Oh, right, sure. Yes.
So, Mandy, you mentioned that 22,000 of 24,000 Japanese in BC were sent to the internment camps. What was different about the 2,000 that didn't get taken?
Yeah, okay, thank you. So she was just saying that 22 out of 24,000 Japanese Canadians were interned. So it was Japanese Canadians who lived 100 miles within the West Coast. So if you were outside of that area, you were allowed to remain in BC.
And that was only 2,000 people?
That was only 2,000 people. And so, even when they were allowed to return back to BC 5 years after the war, but, they were allowed to return at that point. But by that time, they'd already, moved on to Ontario and Quebec and Alberta and restarted their lives. So very few of them actually came back to BC. Now, Mary Kitagawa, who I played many of her clips, her family actually did go back to Salt Spring, and he went back to the man who had bought his farm. That man wasn't prepared to sell it to him, and but her father was actually able to, get another farm eventually and get very established. And if I could just say a very quick story about that. When Mary's family left the farm, a family friend, a young man, worked for the BC Security Commission, and so he was in charge of, getting everyone to sign the paperwork and, manage all the properties, assure everyone that he had told Mary's mother, Kimmy, don't worry, not one chopstick will be removed from your house, and that he would take care of it. So Mary's property, the farm, and that farm that I talked to you about, which had 600 acres, it was bought by the Salt Spring Real Estate Company, and the president of that company was the young man that was friends with her family. So that's how he was able to obtain that property. And then just one note too, the family now has all left Salt Spring, but they actually donated the land back to Salt Spring so they could build supportive housing for home support workers, people providing healthcare services, but can't afford regular housing. So it was kind of a beautiful way for it to come full circle. Yeah.
Susan, you're making connections with those students. Tell us a little bit more about how you connected with those students.
Well, Marina was the first student that I met, and then my cousin was related to one of my mother's students, so I was able to talk to him through my cousin. But both Marina and my cousins, someone that my cousin knew, they both died quite early, unfortunately. One of the students I connected to through my husband's aunt, who lives in Chatham, and she's not Japanese Canadian. She's not Japanese at all, but she happened to teach with the wife of one of my mother's students. His name was Teddy Takahashi. So that was kind of miraculous, going through Aunt Sally to find one of my mother's students. And then, I put ads in the Japanese Canadian newspaper called the Nikkei Voice. I think I got 1 or 2 responses. Mandy put an ad in the Japanese Canadian Facebook page, and I think I got one response. And we went on the internment camp tour, both Mandy and I and my son. We went on this bus tour through all the internment camps. And some of the people on the tour, I stood up and told them what I was doing, looking for my mother's students. And a couple of them were related to my mother's students. And then the more I talked to the students, the more they were able to link me to other students. So, yeah, they hadn't, and in some cases it was a matter of going through this database called Landscapes of Injustice, which was started about 5 years ago. It's amazing. You can put in someone's name and find out where they came from, where they were interned, when they were born. So I was able to use that to locate some of the students. And I had to comb through many obituaries, I'm sorry to say, but that's a good way to find out, when someone was born and what their parents were, the parents' names, the siblings' names. That's about it. It did. It really did take about, it took 10 years.
I'm curious about the sword. The history that you have uncovered obviously just started with World War II, and your father was your father, right?
That's right.
Right. But you said it was a 4,000-year-old sword, 400-year-old sword.
Right.
So were you able to trace it back?
Yeah. Yeah.
Provenance?
Oh, thanks. So the question is, was I able to retrace my father's 450-year-old samurai sword? So my father's original intention, his wish was that we could find the original family that owned that sword, because that sword would have gone through 450 years together with one family. It would have been passed on from each generation. And unfortunately, I took it to 4 different sword experts, and so we were able to determine that it is a genuine samurai sword. The age of it is 450 years old. They all agreed upon that. But there was a name written of the sword maker, and what they determined was that the name that is actually etched on the sword is actually not the person, this true sword maker that actually produced it. And apparently that was very common, because a lot of the swords were given as gifts to other families. So you could make your gift look even better if it had another sword maker's name on it. Someone told me it was like giving jewelry in a Tiffany box. So I thought that was a really good analogy. But they said to me that unfortunately, because there's not a tag of the family name, and millions of swords were taken out of Japan when they surrendered. When Japan surrendered, even if a family had a sword, the American forces actually made them give it up. So that was difficult. Now, I have recently spoken to a retired CBC journalist that has told me that he actually thinks we can find the families. So right now I'm just trying to figure out the logistics around that. So hopefully one day we will be able to reunite the sword back with its original family.
You'll come back and tell us all about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think it really goes to speak to so many of the, I've heard of another Nisei veteran that actually was able to return the sword, and I think it's an incredible story. I mean, these guys were given the swords legally. That was during war times, they had to be surrendered, and they were passed on to, the allies that came in. And I think it's incredible that even though their land was taken away from them, their belongings, they still felt that they were just the custodians of these swords, and that my father wanted to give it back to the family that originally owned it. So I think that's it really speaks to some of the values of the Nisei as well. Thank you.
I had a question that is somewhat similar, but your father's story wasn't talked about, you said, for a long time. Those of us who had parents involved in the wars, a lot of times they wouldn't talk about it for a long time. At what point did you encourage, or how did it come about that you started to get that information from the family?
Oh, yeah, great question. So the question is that when did we start talking to our parents more, or when did we hear more about the stories? And we have two different experiences, so I'll talk first, Susan, then you can speak to that. But I think, unfortunately, the Nisei got in the habit of not telling the stories, and we got in the habit of not asking. And I think for a lot of the people of my generation, once they've heard the stories too, there's a lot of sadness and a lot of processing and feeling guilty too that we didn't ask more. But I would say for my parents, when the federal government or when Brian Maroney apologized, that really did open the door to a lot of Nisei talking more about it. I mean, it was very, it was complicated in that some of them thought when they got the apology and the money back, that actually made them really worry, because they thought, oh, we're drawing attention to ourselves, and maybe we will become targets again. And a lot of them actually donated the money because they felt conflicted about receiving it. But I think for a lot of people, for most Japanese Canadians, they were very proud to get the apology. And it gave them permission to talk about their stories more than they ever had before. And my father was really proud, so the veterans got to go and meet Brian Maroney, and they got to dress, in their uniforms and the medals. And it was, I think, a time of, a lot of healing. At the same time, as Susan mentioned, they felt sad that their parents didn't get the money, and the apology. So do you want to talk?
Thank you. Thanks, Mandy. My mother was kind of the opposite of most Nisei. Most Nisei didn't talk about the internment or their military career or anything like that. My mother was so angry about what happened during the war to her that she never stopped talking about it to my brother and me all the time. Yeah, she was always talking about it. And so when we went, Mandy and I and my son, we went on the internment camp tour, we met lots of people of my generation that knew nothing about their parents' history. And my son and I were shocked because, we'd been hearing about it all our lives. In the case of my father died 51 years ago, and I never had the common sense to ask him what he did during the war. And he never talked about it when I was a kid. So about 10 years ago, I was asked to give a speech in Vancouver at the Japanese-Canadian War Memorial. And the only resource I had was my uncle, who had served with Mandy's father and my father in Southeast Asia. So my uncle, who had actually never talked to very many people about this, he just started to open up. I think he was about 90. He was maybe 93, and he just started to open up. And I spent hours and hours on the phone with him, talking about our family and talking about the war service of my father. So that's how I learned about what my father and what my uncle and Mandy's father did during the war. Thank you for asking.
I've been aware, as I suppose most of us have, about this event in time. And you showed us those ripples coming even into this room, and how that has spread from that time. It's really quite amazing. I thank you for that. Where do you hope the stories go from here?
Oh, thanks. So thanks for asking. Where do we hope the stories go from here? Well, I hope that I hope that our story inspires more people to talk about their family histories, of any background. I think so many times our parents' generation endured so much more than what we did, regardless of whatever, your race or your racial background is. I probably will try to extend another podcast episode, perhaps, looking more at the origins of the sword. I hope to make it into like a shorter documentary, so I'm talking to some filmmakers, because it is now mandatory. This is the first school year that Japanese Canadian history is actually being taught in BC high schools, so I was told that, the podcast is quite long. It has to be much more shorter and condensed. So, so those are some of our ideas. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's awesome that, so many people that are younger than, Susan and I are really interested in their Japanese Canadian history and are creating many plays. And there was ballet performance called Kimiko Pearls that just won the Juno Award for their musics, and that was done by a Yonsei. So I really hope the stories do continue. Well, thanks for asking. How about you, Susan?
When Mandy and I were in Ottawa last week, I stayed with a couple of friends of mine, a friend from university and her partner, who happens to be from the same town that I'm from. And Bob told me, well, I think our talk actually inspired Bob to do something about his father's story. His father, who I guess knew my father because they were both Legion members in my town. His father had PTSD. He was a Second World War bomber pilot, and he was shot down over Poland and spent 3 years in Szczecin, Poland, as a POW. And during that time that he was interned, he sent many he home to his mother in Northern Ontario. So Bob has these letters, and he has his father's uniforms and has his father's badges and things like that. He said, after seeing your talk, I think I'd like to go and talk to the War Museum and see if they'd like me to donate some of this stuff. And I think, I might go and write a book. So that's wonderful that, our talk gave Bob the idea to find out more about his dad's war history.
Yeah, so I came tonight because last year I happened to read 2 great books about this particular topic. One of them is available at the Minden Library, and the title is Forgiveness, the lessons I learned from my grandparents. And it chronicles the grandpa who went to war, was caught, spent time in the Japanese internment camp. It's on par with Unbroken, this story. And grandma, Japanese family, she was sent, I think, to a camp in Alberta, and it was
Sugar Beet Farm.
Chicken coop to refurbish, and I think worked for free for the farmer to harvest beets, and severely cold, -40 below winter, and survive. And then later on, Japanese family had a son, and the survivor for the Japanese camp had a daughter, and they got together, and if it wasn't for that forgiveness, the grandson, of course, wouldn't be there writing the book. Another great book based on non-fiction story, but fictional. I think the title is Around the Corner of the Canada Hotel, or just around the corner of the Heartbreak Canada Hotel. And it chronicles exactly what you showed us about BC, how they had a Japanese town, they were all fishermen, there was jealousy in the community about their, how they almost had a monopoly of the fishery in Japan, or in Seattle. So they were all sent to camp. It's a cute story about a Chinese boy who gets bullied. A Japanese girl shows up, and he falls in love with her. It's maybe grade 7 or 8. Then he has to go against his own Chinese family to have the romance. Then Pearl Harbor hits, and it chronicles the whole story on how then they were transferred to an internal camp just outside, and then later on. But the story about the Panama Hotel is that the Japanese stored memories there, and 50 years later, that was uncovered, and yeah, so great stories.
Yes, those are both very good books.
And the forgiveness one was one of the best stories I've ever found.
Oh, yeah.
Another book, if you're interested in the Japanese-Canadian internment, an excellent book is called Requiem by Frances Itani. She's not Japanese-Canadian herself, but her late husband, and he was interned also. And before my mother died, she read Requiem. That was the last book my mother read. We read it together, and we both agreed that it just conveys the feeling of being interned on a sugar beet farm. It was just so accurate, and it just, my mother said the feelings were so just sincere and genuine, the feelings evoked from that book. So if you have a chance, please read that book. And she came to our talk. Actually, Frances came to our talk in Ottawa, which we were very humbled by.
Yeah, and just on a side note, no Japanese war, no me. If there was not a Japanese war, I would not be here. My father was born in a Japanese camp for Dutch. And my grandfather worked in Indonesia. He did not work on the River Clyde, but he certainly worked on bridges and railroads and et cetera. And they were interned in the Japanese camp in Florida in 1943 in the Japanese camp in Florida.
Wow, that's amazing.
Wow. Thank you for sharing your stories.
Yes.
Is there any other questions? Oh, yes.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. So much information. And I'm embarrassed, but I don't know a lot of history in terms of the other provinces. Were there other provinces that were as harsh as British Columbia in terms of during the time of internment?
Mm-hmm. Well, no. I think
the federal government supported BC, I'm guessing, in decision.
Well, initially, the question is, did other provinces enforce the same kind of, internment in BC? No, because I think most Japanese Canadians lived in BC. The majority of them did. I mean, a lot of them chose, you had a choice. You could go to the internment, but you could also go to these sugar beet farms in Alberta where, as this fellow over here indicated, those conditions were terrible. People thought they would be better and their families would stay together, but in fact they were very isolated because they worked for farmers almost for nothing, and as he mentioned, families lived in chicken coops and barns. So so the conditions in Alberta were quite harsh as well. Now, when they came to Ontario, they were banned as well. Like, Japanese Canadians were banned from living in Toronto, so many of them pretended they were Chinese Canadians, or they lived very quiet lives in the hopes of not bringing much attention to themselves. But no, I think, do you have anything to add to that?
No, just that, really the BC was a very racist province, not just for Japanese, but for other races. Anyone that wasn't white basically was mistreated, from the 1800s right up to the Second World War. But a lot of people blame Mackenzie King for all the things that happened to the Japanese Canadians. He was the prime minister, but he was being forced all the time by the politicians in BC to enact these policies against the Japanese Canadians. And it was really, it was the politicians in BC that they were behind all these things that happened during the internment. The politicians in Ontario, Quebec, well, there were very few Japanese Canadians there, so they probably didn't even think about us.
And there was opposition from the CCF, which was, is the NDP now. But yeah, they said, Jack Pickersgill, the assistant to the prime minister, he said that in one book that, there was not an MP in Parliament that he truly believed that the Japanese were a threat. So, there was definitely opposition. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, Sue.
Perhaps regarding other provinces, you could tell us what happened to your father's family, where they went and how they were treated?
My father's family? Yeah, well, I mentioned that my father's family was saved from internment by Nelson Spencer, Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Spencer, who had commanded a battalion of Japanese Canadians in the First World War. He really liked Japanese Canadians. He'd seen them, what they were like in the war. They were very brave. And so my grandfather, not the grandfather that I described here, but my father's father, worked for him. And my grandfather died in 1938, but my father had, he had a master's degree in chemical engineering, but he couldn't get a job in BC, so he worked as a gardener for his father's company. The three older sons worked for their father's company even after the father died. So Nelson Spencer warned my family in 1942 that something very bad is coming. They're about to send Japanese Canadians to prison camps, so you better do something. And he said, would you like to go to Ontario? I have a friend that has a farm there, and if you go there, you won't be interned. So they said yes. And it turned out that the person that owned the farm was the Premier of Ontario, Premier Hepburn. And he hired a bunch of Japanese Canadians to get them out of BC, which was amazing. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Sorry, we got one else.
So I don't speak Japanese, but on your podcast, there is a Japanese term, shikata ganai.
Shikata ganai, yes.
And you had someone on the podcast talk about
Yeah.
that, and I wonder if you could just talk about what the meaning of that is and how that was reflected in Issei and Issei sort of response to...
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, okay. So, Sue, so is it Sue? Sue was asking in the podcast, I said this phrase, shikata ganai. I just want to let you know that took me 100 times to be able to say that. But it's funny because everyone I interviewed said, well, shikata ganai, which means like it's a Japanese philosophy that you must go on, you must endure, you must look towards tomorrow.
It means it can't be helped.
It can't be helped.
About it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's both, right? It's kind of like this couldn't be helped, but also I think it's it has remnants of gaman, which is resilience, which is and also too like we must work collectively together. And collectively, we will both endure, but we also will collectively achieve and rise again. So it's a very Japanese saying. Do you want to mention about Shirley being here? Do you want to say, like we do have a Nisei in the crowd. We're wondering, Shirley, if you could you stand up because thank you so much for coming today and. Shirley was a resident at Caslow, but was very young, so we're so touched that you came today, Shirley. Yeah. Is there any other questions? Just being cognizant of the time, should we wrap it up? So thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate your interest, and we love being in Haliburton. Actually, I was a chambermaid here when I was 16. I don't know if anyone recognizes me. And I had a fantastic summer, so we're both just so glad to be here, and thank you so much.